This morning we get the joy of hearing from a dear brother, a pastor, a friend, um, a writer, an academic, a man working on his PhD. God bless him in that endeavor. Um, I first was introduced to Phil Allen Jr. in a Christian ethics class on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So this weekend being especially fitting to have Phil here. Um, Phil was across the room. I was sitting next door, or next door. I was sitting next to Inez, under the teaching of a Korean professor. So just putting all that together, um, a Korean professor teaching us Dr. King as I'm sitting next to a Latina, as a black man across the room stands up as this white man listens. I think only at Fuller Seminary does that happen. All of those pieces, but Phil begins to share, and I didn't realize it at the time, but he's told me later this was the first time he had shared this so publicly, about the lynching of his grandfather and the story that God was beginning to invite him to go explore, to uncover, to investigate, to hear the truth. Because there was one side of the story that had always been told. There was another side of the story that was the whole story. That was the truth. And so Phil went on a journey over the course of a couple of years. And Phil, you can correct that if that's wrong, but he went on a journey to go explore things that even his family had never fully known the full truth of. And what developed there was what would become a documentary, as Phil very vulnerably and openly and courageously shared his story. He invited me to be a part of that, and I was really nervous to say yes, because when somebody's story is so sacred, you don't want to say yes and then be on camera and mess it up. It's just so good and so weighty and so powerful that I felt the weight of what Phil was undertaking. So it was just such an honor to be a part of that process. The documentary is something that we as a church want to host a screening of next month, an opportunity for us to sit and to hear and hold Phil's story even more. And then Phil, after writing or after producing, directing, being a part of the whole documentary, then decided to put it into a book. He's just a glutton for punishment, I suppose, or he's just incredibly gifted in so many ways. So Phil has a book that is coming out, and it's actually available for pre-order on Amazon. This is the documentary in book format and able to dive even deeper. So you can pre-order this thing already. I vouch for this man's work. I vouch for his integrity. I vouch for the authority of God's heart upon him. And so I invite you to check that out, to be a part of the documentary screening with us next month. But today, I especially invite you to put your hands into God's hands as Pastor Phil Allen Jr. brings us a word. And so, Phil, enjoy preaching today. Lean in, be free, and know that we will follow your leadership. We're eager and excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bobby. All right, I got 45 minutes to preach this message, so I need to dive right in. No, I'm just kidding. I first want to acknowledge and thank Pastors Inez and Bobby for having me here. And it's always an honor to join them in ministry and serve with them and preach the word of God. They blessed my church, Own Your Faith, when we were going for the last few years. They blessed us so much. I want to acknowledge Rob and Amy, to the spouses, beautiful people. I've had a chance to get to know them over dinner, lunch a few times, and hanging out with them, and so much wisdom. It's just unfair for that much power to be in those two couples. But God bless y'all. Put your hands in God's hands. That was one of the last things my grandfather said to me before he passed away. So I hold that very dear, Bobby. Let me dive in, because my time starts actually right now, not the intro. That didn't count. My time starts right now. I want to talk to you about, I want to delve into Micah 6:8, one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture. Before we get there, though, I got some questions for you, and I want you to be question askers. One of the scariest times of my life is when I asked God the question. I'll never forget, I was sitting at Earth Cafe. I was sitting at Earth Cafe in Beverly Hills 15 and a half years ago. I had just gotten a call to ministry, had no clue what that meant. And I asked the question while I was eating a bread pudding and apple cider, warm apple cider. I remember it to this day. And I looked up and I said, God, what are you calling me to do? What do you want me to do? Listen to me. If you don't really want to know what God's called you to do, don't ask that question. If you don't want to embark on this journey, if you don't want to immerse yourself in that adventure, the good, bad, and the ugly that comes with that, don't ask the question, because there's going to be revelation that comes after that. It was one of the scariest things, scariest visions God gave me in my life, and God has so confirmed it over the years. Another huge question that I asked relating to this film in this book was, I asked my grandmother years ago, I said, Grandma, what happened to my grandfather? Because they would not talk about him. I never knew anything about my grandfather until I embarked on this journey in the last 5 years. And at first, she never answered me. Her body got small. It was like she was reliving a moment, a traumatic time. But I asked that question, what happened to my grandfather? And I've been on this journey ever since, and it's literally changed the course and direction of my life and calling. You know, we're in some difficult times right now, if we're honest. And I know you've heard that over and over again. We can look for the silver lining, but the reality is we're at a time of trauma, turmoil, and chaos that we're witnessing and experiencing. But what's worse than coming up with the wrong solutions is asking the wrong questions. That's even worse. So I'm going to start with a question, or a few questions Dr. King asked in Letter from a Birmingham City Jail. One of my favorite letters that Dr. King wrote. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at her beautiful churches and their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlay of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over again, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave the clarion call for defiance and hatred? He poses these questions to himself, and it's forcing him to have to reflect. And I don't know if we do that enough. I don't know if we appreciate the revelation in the questions. Here's my thesis for you seminarians out there. You get that? Sometimes the prophetic revelation from God is not insight, but inquiry. And I think we're going to see that in Micah 6:8. Sometimes it's the questions God asks us, or we ask ourselves or others, that really matter. In Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve had sinned and Adam was hiding from God, and he says, I was naked and afraid. And then God asks a question. The omniscient God, omniscience, all-knowing God, he would have known the answer, but yet he asked the question, who told you you were naked? Job, after Job lays out his complaint, Job is venting to God because of all that he has suffered. And God asks him a series of questions. I'm going to list a few of them. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Have the gates of hell been revealed to you? Have you an arm like God? Will you condemn me? I guarantee you, Job had to sit on those questions for a while. How do you answer questions like that when they're dropped in your spirit, right? Jesus asked the man at Bethesda, the man who had been an invalid for 38 years, Jesus comes and doesn't just heal him. Jesus says, do you want to be made well? Jesus encounters Saul on the Damascus road, and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I want you to look at all the questions that you come across in scripture, and what insight comes from that? What revelation do you get just from the questions? Pastor Inez reminded us a couple of weeks ago, the very name of Micah. Who is like God? You can't even say the name of Micah without reflecting on a question. You may not realize it, but his very name is a question. Who is like God? I believe that that's where we should be sitting right now during these times. God, what are the questions I should be asking that takes me on the journey to the solutions, to the answers? We just to reiterate what Pastor Inez said a few weeks ago, Micah is the prophet of the poor. He speaks from the margins, not from a position of power and privilege. He's addressing the exploitation of the poor. In other words, Micah is concerned about the invisible, the voiceless, and the powerless. And this part I love. I love. This is the prophetic call. It's for the last, the lost, the least, the lonely, and the left out, as only Pastor Inez could articulate for us. And so we come to Micah 6:6-8, and we get the scene. We're in court, y'all. We're in court. And God has an issue, an indictment against Israel, as we see earlier in the chapter, in chapter 6. So God, here are the characters. God is playing the role of prosecutor and judge. Creation plays the role possibly of jurors, but of at least those in the gallery who are witnessing the trial, right? And then there's Israel making their case before God. But my first question is, why is creation there? What was so important about creation? In verse 1, it says, arise, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Hear you, mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel. Why was creation there? Why was it so necessary? And it brought me to Romans chapter 8, where creation groans with birth pains. Why is creation groaning under the corruption? I would imagine Paul is saying creation's groaning because of our poor stewardship, our exploitation of creation, abuse of creation, neglect of creation, and commodification of creation for our profit. But could it be that creation is also groaning because creation witnesses the injustices among humanity? That creation groans at George Floyd's death. Creation groans at what we see with the immigrants at the border. Creation groans at the injustices across the globe. Could that be? And so Israel is making the case before God and before creation. But I want you to enter into this passage. When we think about Israel, when we think about the person who represents Israel in this passage, verses 6-8, I want you to think about it being, and rather than being Israel, let's make it personal. It's the U.S. making its case. It's America making its case. So America is saying, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? That's America. God, how do we make this right? How much do we give from our affluence? From our abundance? You know, we always talk about how great America is at giving to everyone. Giving to all the nations across the globe that are in need. How we've helped so many people. But that's the wrong question. The question is not about what do we give to God. God rejects this offering. God doesn't reject the sacrifices and offering because he doesn't like them. God rejects the sacrifices and offerings because they are insufficient by themselves. Worship is in vain if not accompanied by fruit, and that fruit is social fruit. How do we love one another? Question is, what haven't we been practicing that pleases God? Let me say that again. It's not so much, God, how much tithes and offerings, how much singing, how much praise, how much serving do we do at Skid Row? It's not just about that. But what else haven't we been practicing, God, that pleases you? America's benevolence is futile when we consider the wealth gap between the rich and the poor born out of capitalism. The last 40 years in my lifetime, there's been a 200+% increase in salary by the executives, but only a 16% increase in wages from the workers with more production. There are over 500,000 homeless people across our country. The racial disparities in wages, jobs, education, and incarceration, that diabolical nature of the prison industrial complex, the effects of eco-injustice on the poor and communities of color, and COVID-19 only serve to expose all of this. And so we stand before God pleading our case. But here's what's interesting. Before God is a God that's punitive. God is a God that's less punitive and offers rehabilitation, a God of grace. Imagine standing before a judge and you actually committed the crime. You're actually guilty. But rather than sending you to prison, he says, I'm going to send you to a treatment program. I'm going to send you to rehab. Court appointed, court ordered. A God of grace. I want you to see that in the prophetic revelation here is grace. Built into this is grace. And here's what God says. Here's what he says in verse 8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. In other words, he says, let's walk through this really quick. He says, he has told you, O mortal, O Israel. He has told you, O US, America, what is good. In other words, you already know. Let's just pause for a second. You already know. Look back throughout history. We know what we ought to be doing. We know what we ought to be saying. We know what we ought to be standing for. This isn't new. What we're experiencing isn't new. It's just recycled. He says, he has told you, O mortal, what is good. Here's the question. What is good? What does that mean? We throw that around. Bobby, you're a good man. What do I mean by that? Rob, you're a good man. Amy, you're a good woman. What do I mean by that? I go back to Genesis 1 and 2. Real quick, I want to unpack that. Genesis 1 and 2, we see that God creates, and every time God creates, God makes observations, and God says, it is good, it is good, it is good. And then God gets to, in Genesis 2, where he creates the animals and everything. He has Adam, but there's no Eve yet, and God says, it is not good. Then God creates Eve, and we see, go back to Genesis chapter 1 at the end, it is very good. What is very good? Creation is now complete. So what does good mean? Just as God intended it to be. Nothing else needs to be added. That's what it means to be good. That's why when Jesus says, no one is good but the Father, because nothing else needs to be added to God to call God good. It is perfect. It is complete. It is whole. He has told you, O mortal, what is whole, what is complete, what is mature, what is good. Nothing else needs to be added to this. But what does God require? What is God looking for? What does God seek? What does God demand? 1, do justice. This is not just about living right, although we're supposed to, we should be. This is not just about acknowledging when something is wrong and should be changed. The biggest word in there is do. Cause justice to happen. Execute justice. In other words, both socially and politically, interpersonally, and dealing with engaging the systems and structures that perpetuate the very injustices that we see generation after generation after generation. So the first thing he says, and I think there's something significant about the order, the first thing is make the wrongs right. Now, I can't tell you what you're called to do in that whole process. Some, you may be called to fund the programs and the organizations that are doing the work. Some, you're called to be on the ground. Some, you're called to be visionaries and start the organizations. Some, you're called to be at the marches, maybe leading the marches, forming the petitions to sign, doing the research, like my friend Mary, being a part of doing the research to get the data about policing in America. That's up to you for God to make clear to you what you're called. I go back to that question I asked. God, what are you calling me to do? I dare you to ask that question. God, what are you calling me to do? How do I cause justice to happen? How do I execute justice, both socially and politically? We can't get away from the political. It's built into our faith. He says, do justice. And then he says, love kindness. This is my favorite because it's real simple. He says, love kindness. Guess what he's saying? The most accurate translation is love, love. But he had to use a different word because it wouldn't make sense. Love, love. Literally is the translation. Love, chesed. The kind of love that God has towards us. In other words, he's speaking not just about the execution of love, but the attitude towards it. Delight in love is what he's saying. I should want to love you. I should want to see justice happen. I should want to have mercy. I should want to love you with the love of God. I should want that. The word hesed, that second love is hesed love. It describes God's love in the Old Testament. And it's such a complex, such a deep sense of what love is. They couldn't use one word to describe it. It's described as or translated as loving kindness, steadfast love, covenantal love, faithful love. Like you need a paragraph just to understand chesed, right? And yet he says, you're called to love hesed. You're called to delight in, to want to love. I think that may be the issue for a lot of us. We don't want to love. It's too much work. It's too heavy, a burden, a responsibility. It's easy to keep the attitude. I know it is for me. It's real easy for me to look on social media, for me to watch the news and see the people who I just have a disdain for. It's easy for me to sit in that. How do I love love? I think I got enough time to add this to it. I remember when the Lord convicted me and said, you've forgiven your father, but you don't love him. So I started doing acts of love out of obligation. And then God said, you've forgiven your father and you do the love thing, but you don't honor him. That's where the loving love came in. Wanting to speak well of my father. Wanting to esteem my father before others. And I cried in the shower like a baby. Because God wasn't just calling me to love my father. He was calling me to like loving my father. He was calling me to want to love my father. He was calling me to love, love. Ah. He was calling me to love, love. And I close with this. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Listen to me. I don't believe you get this last one without the first two. I don't believe you get this last one by staying silent. As Dr. King said, it's not just the actions of the bad people, but it's the silence of the good people. Walk humbly with your God. He's alluding to covenant. Your God is covenant language. Your God. Going back to the 10 Commandments. Your God. I will be your God. Covenant language. To walk with God is to live as one. To walk humbly is to live, to practice, to live as ones who are dependent upon God. My life is dependent upon God. Therein lies my power. As Jesus tells Paul, my power is made whole in your weakness. Weakness causes me to depend upon God, not just my intellect, not just degrees, not just a pulpit, not just platform and network and finances. None of it. I depend upon God because therein lies my power. Dr. Lee, who will be on my podcast starting tomorrow, his episode, he asked a question. He says, "This is one question that drives me. How did the boycotters march for 381 days without giving up or giving in?" That's a question. How did they do it? I suspect they drew from their ancestors who endured 246 years of slavery. I suggest they drew from those who went before them during Jim Crow, who feared lynching and lost family members like my grandfather and my great-grandfather to lynching or to murder at the hands of racism. I suggest they drew upon that. Just as they carried the trauma of intergenerational trauma from their ancestors, they also carried the resiliency of their ancestors in their DNA as well. I want us to carry the DNA of the prophetic call of Micah. I want us to ask the questions. And I want us to not be afraid to take the journey to where we begin to execute justice, love, and walk humbly with God, even in times like today. Thank you.